Hi everyone, this is Ellen from the Astrology Journal. I want to talk about the chart for the conjunction coming up between Mars and Uranus. And that's happening, you can see it here, at 26 degrees of Taurus, the third decan of Taurus. That is happening on July 15th, 2024, at about 10:04 Eastern Daylight Time. The Mars-Uranus conjunction happens every couple of years, so we had one in 2022 about this time of year, and we'll have another one in 2024 around this time of year. There's a lot going on in this chart, so I want to just point out the patterns, and then I'll talk about them. So there's a Yod pattern that's involving Jupiter, the Moon, and Ceres. There's what I call a developmental trine. This is not an official pattern, but I recognize it as one. And it is involving Mars and Uranus at the point, and then the South Node, and then Ceres. And typically, I don't actually usually look at Ceres, but because Mars and Uranus are happening in Taurus, and Taurus being an earthy sign and very much related to the resources of the earth, I wanted to look at Ceres, Ceres being a dwarf planet that governs agriculture and the harvest. So I thought that was really relevant to look at. And so we end up with this pattern because I've included it. And another one that's a little bit harder to see because I didn't put the lines very strong, but there's a T-square involving the nodes and a focal point on Ceres up here. So a T-square is made up of an opposition, and two squares is a thin green line, and then a thick green line here representing those squares. This developmental triangle is made up of two sesquiquadrates, which are these two lines here, and a square pattern or a square line here. And then the inconjuncts are made up of, the Yod pattern is made up of two inconjuncts. So this line here and this line here, these dash lines, and then a sextile pattern. A sextile aspect. So those are the aspect patterns. And then there's this trine between the Uranus and Mars and Pluto. And this is what's called an out-of-sign trine. So a trine is 120 degrees, and all signs of a given element, they're all 120 degrees from each other. So Aries, a fire sign, is 120 degrees from Leo. Leo is 120 degrees from Sagittarius. Sagittarius is 120 degrees from Aries. And the same thing. So those are all fire signs. The same thing with earth signs. So Taurus is 120 degrees from Virgo. Virgo is 120 degrees from Capricorn, and Capricorn is 120 degrees from Taurus. And the same with air signs, and the same with water signs. So an out-of-sign trine just means that the planets on each end of the aspect are in different elements, but they're still within what we call an orb, so we call it an out-of-sign trine. So that is that. And this trine is really significant, but I'll talk about that at the end. So let's start with these triangle patterns. So the T-square is a triangle pattern, and this green triangle is a triangle pattern. And I call this green triangle a developmental trine, or a developmental triangle. And this T-square could also be called a developmental triangle. And the reason is because they have something in common. The sesquiquadrate made up the developmental triangle made up of these two sesquiquadrates and a square. These aspects, if we map them out on the astrology wheel, the sesquiquadrate is 135 degrees, and that falls here at 15 degrees of Leo, and you can see there's this line here. And if we go backwards this way and count 135 degrees, it lines up at 15 degrees of Scorpio. So to me, this would be the waxing sesquiquadrate is Leonian in nature, and specifically gibbous in nature, because this line represents the beginning of the gibbous phase. This outer wheel is the phases lined up with the natural wheel. And this 15 degrees of Scorpio, this is a waning sesquiquadrate that lines up with Scorpio, so it's scorpionic in my mind, and also lines up with the harvest or the disseminating phase. And then the square, there are two squares. If we count 90 degrees, that's the degree distance of the square. That brings us to 0 degrees of Cancer and the start of the first quarter phase. And if we count backwards, we get to 90 degrees of Capricorn, 0 degrees of Capricorn, and that starts the last quarter phase. So this is the waxing square, and this is the waning square. So, and then the opposition, so we have these two squares and the T-square, right? And we also have an opposition, and the opposition is 180 degrees. And if we count 180 degrees, we get here to 0 degrees of Libra. And again, all of these degrees line up with the beginning of a phase when the phases are laid out on the natural wheel or lined up with the natural wheel. And so I think of the beginnings of the phases, these lines, as like phase gates or developmental gates. So I think of aspect patterns made up of these degrees as developmental patterns. So what does developmental mean in my mind? So you can think of, if you think about Dane Rudger, he talks about the square, for example, as being either crisis in consciousness or crisis in action. So the waxing square is crisis in action, and the waning square is crisis in consciousness. So what's a crisis? There's two ways to think about a crisis. The first is as a developmental challenge, and if we have the foundations in place and we have the support we need, we're actually ready for those challenges. We're eager for them. We want to move into them. We may have a little bit of a hesitation or sensitive period as we're starting the transition, but generally we're sort of wired for these developmental moments. That's how I think of it. But conventionally, we usually think of crisis as like an overwhelming challenge that's beyond, we don't really have what we need to do it, and that's what the crisis is. So how I think about those two things, if I'm thinking developmentally, is if we've been able to lay down the developmental foundations we've needed to get us to this point at whatever developmental gate we're at, and we have what we need in place to the support we need to move through this developmental challenge, then that's just a developmental crisis. If we don't have the prior foundations or we don't have the support we need now, then that becomes a different kind of crisis. And so the way that I think of that is as an opportunity. So if we don't have what we need, then that becomes an opportunity to look and to see what isn't in place. Is it something that I need right now in this specific circumstance? Are there previous foundations that I didn't get to build up? And so it becomes an opportunity to go back and develop something. If you think about a fitness enthusiast or whatever, or an athlete, and they get injured, well, they go to a physical therapist, and the physical therapist will see why that injury happened. Let's say so there are two types of injuries. There's an acute sort of insult to the body, and that causes an injury. Or there's what's called an overuse injury, something that develops over time chronically because of a movement imbalance or, muscle weakness or whatever. And so if the issue is a chronic overuse injury, then the physical therapist will look to see what caused the problem, and then they'll work to develop that up so that you don't end up having that problem again. They'll work to correct that pattern in you so it won't happen again. So that's sort of, and so you'll do these exercises, these kind of remedial exercises to bring your body back into alignment, and whatever parts need to be built up to be able to do the work they're supposed to do, they'll be brought into alignment and built up to strength. So now your body can work in harmony with itself, and you won't, you're not going to have these developmental or these overuse injuries cropping up. So I think of life sort of in the same way. And one of the challenges that can happen, like if you're an athlete, doing remedial exercises, for professional athletes, I don't think it's a big deal, but I know that in my generation, when I was growing up, to do like remedial exercises or anything that was less than the best to prove you were better than others, then that was kind of embarrassing, right? You didn't want to do that. You didn't want to lower yourself to that. But that works against us. That worked against us. We didn't actually. Because we were, or at least in my case, I was striving to be beyond where I was, I didn't actually get to build up the foundations that I needed to get to where I wanted to be, right? So when I was sick, and sorry, this is just a little bit of a story, when I was sick, and it's still something I'm working through, and I wasn't able to do things that I could do before. It took me a long time to let go of what I thought I should be able to do, and to just start to finally recognize, oh, I can't do that. I need to be doing this. And then it took a long time to get over my sort of embarrassment that I had to do these things, like say, for example, wall push-ups. And eventually I got to a point where I was like, oh, this is super cool. I'm getting to build up foundations. What other foundation could I build up? Is there something even more remedial or more prior that I could learn to do, that I could build up and do? So that's kind of the idea. So when I talk about opportunity, I'm talking about that. There's always an opportunity to build something up, and we want to always be looking for that. If we find ourselves in a crisis, kind of in the conventional kind of way, or a challenge that seems beyond what we can do, well, what's the thing we can do? Another fitness analogy I want to bring in is there's a fitness guy, like a guru type of guy. His name is Scott Sonnen, and his company, or at least his company, was RMAX International. I assume it still is, but I haven't followed him for a long time. But he's created a lot of programs. He works especially with people like first responders and things like that. And he's created programs that are designed specifically for people in those industries, because they're designed to help you de-stress. You're under so much stress that how can we design programs that actually help you de-stress, so you're not actually adding extra load, and you're helping your body be able to develop. I'm not explaining it very well, but I think he has really intelligent programs, and they're designed so that there's a beginner level, an intermediate level, an advanced level, etc. And so say you've worked through the beginner level program, and now you're in the intermediate program. And so the exercises that you do in the beginner level program, those then become the foundation for the exercises you do in the intermediate program. So you're doing more advanced levels of the beginner level exercises. So what Sonnen recommends is that when you're doing like an intermediate level workout, and you get to a point where it's like, I got to stop, I got to take a break, he's like, well, try scaling back to that beginner level version of that exercise and see if you can keep going. So when you know the foundations and the steps that get you to where you are, then you can always scale back to whatever is needed in the moment. And if you don't know what that is, well, then you can start to learn. You can start to understand that everything's built on foundations. Everything's built on everything else. So that's why I think of these. So that's my idea about these developmental triangles. Is sort of these. They go along with these what I call phase gates, and I think of these phase gates as developmental shifts. And and this is just something I'm playing around with. I don't have any training in psychology or child development or anything. These are just my ideas that I'm working with, particularly as they relate to my own healing journey. And the other thing that goes along with this is Capricorn. So I live in the Northern Hemisphere, and so when I look at the signs, I think of them from a Northern Hemisphere seasonal perspective. And in the Northern Hemisphere, the start of Capricorn aligns with the winter solstice, so the beginning of winter. So Capricorn, when we have the winter solstice, that is when Capricorn begins. And so it's the beginning of a time where the energies are withdrawn. We're not able to go out and just pick food. We have to have already grown our food and picked the harvest. And now what we're relying on is what we've stored away. And so a kind of a metaphor is that Capricorn symbolically represents reality, and we can think of reality as the patterns we've built up over time, and that's what we're experiencing now. And so when we head into, if we're in a time of abundance, we may not notice that the patterns that we're running aren't actually necessarily the best patterns for us. But when we hit a period of lack, of scarcity, then they might show up. And so that becomes an opportunity, right? We can start to see what those patterns are, and that they're not able to support us through this challenging time, this natural kind of waning of the energies. That's going to, it's just a part of the natural pattern. There's nothing wrong with that. And those natural wanings then become our opportunities to evaluate where we are and how we've been doing, and we can start to look at our patterns and say, is this really the best thing for me? Is this really helping me? Am I in a good situation here? And if not, what are the patterns that I'm running that have created this situation, this reality? So I think that makes sense how I'm seeing those related. Typically, I think of the inner world, the inner processes, but it is interesting to think about Ceres here in Capricorn, Ceres being the goddess of agriculture and the harvest. And if I'm just curious, I'm not going to say a lot about it, but I'm really curious over these next couple of years, what comes to the surface in terms of our agricultural practices, our mainstream agricultural practices in the world. They don't they're not really sustainable. They tend to use up land and deplete it rather than replenish it over time, whereas something like permaculture will replenish land over time and improve the soil over time. So a lot of people already know about this, but I'm wondering if more people are going to become aware of it and we'll just get more information around it. And this actually brings me to this yod pattern that has Jupiter at the focal point. So Jupiter is in Gemini, and Gemini is about information and perspective and curiosity. It doesn't care about meaning. It's just interested in gathering information and getting perspective. And then Jupiter's job is to make the connections and to bring meaning. And Jupiter also enlarges. So I think we're going to be getting a lot of information. Whether that information is going to help us personally in terms of our own, personal growth and healing and self-development processes, or in the larger world, helping us get a better perspective of the world that we're in. So I think that's one thing that's going to be happening. And the purpose or the intention, as far as I can see, if we think about this yod pattern, so the yod is made up of two inconjuncts and a sextile, and the sextile represents opportunity. And the way that I think about inconjuncts, symbolically in astrology, they represent the need to make adjustments. And my metaphor for these aspects are the suspension cables on a suspension bridge. They angle off the road, the path, to me similarly to the way that the inconjuncts angle off the opposition in a chart. And we can think of the opposition metaphorically as the path that we're trying to walk in balance. And so the job of the suspension cables and the job of the inconjuncts is to make constant adjustments so that the forces that are impacting the road don't break it apart. And so we can think of the need to make adjustments as a positive thing. We need to make adjustments to keep ourselves in harmony as we walk our paths. And so the information, the focal point here is Jupiter and Gemini. So gathering all of that information in theory should help us to make those adjustments. And it's interesting that Jupiter is in this yod pattern with the moon, which is, nurturance, nourishment, mother, and Ceres, harvest, goddess of harvest, and agriculture. And so there's this theme of food, right? Information that has to do with our food. If we think about Uranus and the technology, just going back to the agriculture, like I'm a big fan of technology, but I'm not a big fan of technology being used as a form of compensation for something that hasn't been fully understood. And Jupiter represents this idea of compensation. It also represents natural law. So natural law is a term from evolutionary astrology, and the way that I think about natural law is that which is in alignment with life. And anything else is that, so truth, because Jupiter represents truth and lies, truth is that which is in alignment with life. And lies, or not truth, is that which is out of alignment with what supports life. And belief, and when we're working with belief, which is also Jupiter, that our beliefs are good beliefs for us if they're in alignment with life, with that which supports us in growing into into further development of our life force in positive ways. And the beliefs, we want to chuck beliefs that don't support our life force. I hope that makes sense. So technology, if it's compensating for something that's out of alignment with life, then I see that as a problem. If it's to support life and to bring it back into imbalance and to enhance life in positive ways, then I see that as a good thing. So for an example of supporting life or the idea of enhancing, I saw a video once a long time ago, I won't be able to find it again, but this idea of there was a river, and somebody had figured out that if you kind of lay the rocks in the river in a certain way, it actually supports the river and the life in the river in positive ways. I don't remember the details, but it was really remarkable. And if you lay them in a different way, it causes greater problems. So it was a really fascinating thing. I've always been somebody who's like, don't intervene at all, just let it be, do what it does, and be what it is. But this gave me different insight into that. But if we think about something like agriculture and the fact that our modern agricultural techniques don't actually support life, they deteriorate life over time, they deplete the soils over time, they create weaker crops over time. And you think about the technological innovations like spraying chemicals on the plants, because with monoculture they become more susceptible to pests, and then they're weaker in addition, so they're more susceptible again because of pests. And so we step in with chemicals to take care of that, but we haven't understood the original issue. And same with things like GMO plants or foods or seeds or whatever. Again, those are to make them more resilient, but we haven't understood the original problem. We haven't dealt with that. So we're compensating without having understood the life principle and what actually supports life. And the technology that we're introducing also doesn't really support life. That's my opinion. That's my perspective. So we can, so in our own lives, what's supporting life and what's not supporting life, in terms of our practices, in terms of our beliefs, in terms of, what is life and what's not life, or what do we think life is and think it isn't, and what's really in alignment with truth and reality. Getting a lot of information, perhaps, to help us understand that. and especially around what nurtures and nourishes us. So going back to us and our own personal development and healing and all of that, what nurtures and nourishes us? The moon and Ceres, the goddess. What nurtures and nourishes us? What patterns can we start putting in place that nurture and nourish us, that will sustain us through these more challenging periods of, where the energies naturally start withdrawing for a time? So those are things, and what information that we gather can help us to do that, or information that will be coming to us, or however this happens. The information that will help us to make adjustments that will, we'll just start to understand perhaps in a way we hadn't understood before. So that's a lot of what I want to say. I also want to talk about, though, this trine. There's a trine between Pluto and Mars and Uranus. And as I said, this is an out-of-sign trine. So the trine is about an easy flow of energy. And that easy flow, so if Mars and Uranus and Taurus are working really well together and really good positive energy, and Pluto and Aquarius is working well in itself and really good positive energy, then what will be flowing is good positive energy. The trine just flows the energy, whatever's there. So if there are some things that are missing here, some things that need to be addressed here or here, then what'll flow will be, that which is showing up, what needs to be addressed. So the really interesting thing about this trine is that Pluto is, well, let me say it this way. On December 20th, 2021, Jupiter and Saturn made a conjunction at 0 degrees and 29 minutes of Aquarius. So Pluto is conjuncting that point. On August 8th or 9th, it'll be exactly conjuncting that point, or thereabouts. It's somewhere in there. It'll exactly conjunct that point. And then I didn't look, but it'll go back into Capricorn, and then it's actually going to come back around and go over that point again. I don't actually know when that's going to happen. But the other really interesting thing is that, well, actually, before I say that, so what is this Saturn-Jupiter conjunction thing? Well, every 20 years, Jupiter and Saturn make a conjunction, and they are the societal planets. I like to think of them as the matrix planet. So Jupiter is the beliefs, the mores, the philosophies, the religions, etc. And Saturn is the structures and the traditions and the norms and the rules and the regulations and that sort of thing. So they kind of work together. And I just learned recently, I happened to tune into a video, and I learned that matrix actually comes to us from the Greek language and means womb. I had no idea. That's so fascinating. So we can think of Jupiter and Saturn as like the matrix, the womb into which we are born societally, culturally. So our mother is part of the society culture, and she's of a particular ethnicity, a particular, she lives in a particular country, she has particular beliefs, etc., etc. And then we're born through her womb into that culture. And so I think of the Jupiter-Saturn as like those structures around us, whether they're philosophical or whatever, as the womb that raises us in a way, that influences us, that permeates us. And it shapes us. Saturn shape, form. It shapes us. And so to me, to the extent, so if we think about Jupiter, natural law, which is in alignment with life and supports life, and if we think about Jupiter as governing Sagittarius and Saturn governing Capricorn, well, Sagittarius comes before Saturn on the wheel. So Jupiter and Saturn, the idea of beliefs and truth and natural law, truth and lies, religions, etc., that which is in alignment with life. So if all of that is in alignment with life, then the structures and the traditions and the norms that we create, that we step into and that sort of guide us through our lives, those are going to be in alignment with life. But if these are out of alignment with life, then this is going to be out of alignment with life. So we're impacted by what we're born into. So I think it's really fascinating that Pluto is conjuncting this point. So Pluto is that which, its action is kind of to go down into the bowels, into the darkness, and bring up what needs to be brought up into the light so it can be seen and released. And we know this. We know the drill. It's been happening. But I think we're going to be seeing another layer of this, perhaps around our religious beliefs, but and maybe the intertwining of religion and government in our world. But we're personally going to be experiencing this. Things that have been keeping us stuck in a way. Taurus is a fixed sign. It can be about stuckness. It's kind of slow and steady, but it can be about stuckness too. So things coming to the surface, information coming to the surface that perhaps will help us get unstuck. These patterns that have just been running us, that we maybe even intellectually know about, but we haven't quite been able to release them from our bodies, and they're still running us in certain ways. We can also think of Mars and Uranus as having to do with this theme of separation, which I think is a really important theme. And none of us want that, and none of us agree with it. But what are the tapes? What are the patterns we're running that are just so a part of who we are because of what we grew up in, just the world we live in, that we don't even understand how they're creating separation. I think some of these things, we might be getting information about these, and perhaps, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, so this is just me using science as a metaphor, so scientists forgive me. But Scorpio, which is what Pluto rules, so the moon is in Scorpio, and Pluto rules the moon. These both, Scorpio and Pluto, both have to do with our genes, our genetics, our DNA. So we can almost even think about, and then remember I'm saying this metaphorically, we can almost even think about, information perhaps from our genes kind of releasing and finally, coming up to the surface and releasing. And so freeing us to some degree, Uranus representing freedom from, what has been hindering us. Just because it's been so hardwired in, it's just been so running just as a tape. I don't know how else to say it. And I don't think there's anything nefarious there. I just think it's people, living their lives and making decisions based on the circumstances around them. And it just so happens as those circumstances, those decisions, just like when we're kids, if we grew up in a dysfunctional environment, we make the best decisions we can that will support us in the moment. But we then end up grooving patterns, and those patterns aren't necessarily the best patterns for us. So eventually we have to kind of rewire those patterns. So I see that also happening at a larger, I guess the way that I think about it, it's not so much that I see it, but I can see how that would happen at a larger cultural level too. And perhaps we'll be seeing some more of that happening. So I think this theme of separation and things surfacing that will help us perhaps move to another level around that. One theme in particular, the moon and Cancer. The moon rules Cancer, and Cancer actually in evolutionary astrology, I don't know if this is across the board in astrology, but in evolutionary astrology they talk about as having to do with race. So perhaps themes around racism will be coming up, yeah, so I guess I'll just say that. And then, what I was also going to say is class, and so any kind of hierarchies. Capricorn would be hierarchies. Uranus would be sort of exclusiveness, perhaps, and so this idea of hierarchies, and some people belong and some people don't, and all that kind of stuff. And Pluto, of course, having to do with like oligarchy and that sort of thing. So we may just see all of these kind of things that are about separation starting to getting information about those that hit us in a way they haven't before, that help us to release something, if that makes sense. And then the other thing to say about, and the thing that I didn't say, so Saturn and Jupiter right now are in a crescent phase relationship with one another. They're in a wide square relationship, but they haven't quite reached their first quarter phase. And that happens when they get to be 90 degrees apart. And that will happen on August 18th or 19th, somewhere in there. So I think it's super interesting that at this Mars-Uranus conjunction, Pluto is conjuncting the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction point that happened in 2020. And then on August 18th or 19th, a month later, Saturn and Jupiter will reach their first quarter square point. And remember that Saturn and Jupiter, it's a 20-year cycle. This first quarter waxing phase, in my mind, is about the image that I have is like the young adult stepping out into their world. Now they're independent. They've moved away from their family and they're creating their own separate lives. That's kind of the way that I think about this. So they're finding their own family, their own friends, their own communities, their own homes, their own work, etc. And they're going about and starting to develop the skills that they'll need to sustain them over the long term. The skills and the community and the people and etc. that will sustain them over the long term. It feels like there's one more thing that there's probably a million more things that I wanted to or could say about this chart. Yes, I remember. So Saturn and Jupiter in that first quarter phase. So remember that first quarter phase starts here on the natural wheel at 0 degrees of Cancer. So we have more Cancer symbolism. And so this idea of so on the one hand, nurturance and nourishment and that sort of thing. So separation is an interesting theme, right? To grow, we need to actually move into separation. The baby is born, it separates from its mother. But there's another level of separation that's unhealthy. So on one level, to grow independent, we have to become more separate, yet there's a way in which there's healthy separation and there's unhealthy separation. That's the best that I can say. The other interesting thing about Cancer is that if we look at this trine between Pluto and Mars and Uranus, so the trine is 120 degrees, and 120 degrees falls at, this is a waxing trine, so 120 degrees falls at 0 degrees of Leo. So I think of the waxing trine as Leonian in nature, but in this case, it hasn't quite reached 120 degrees. It's still within orb, so I'll call it a trine, but it isn't quite 120 degrees. It's closer to, it's actually 115 degrees. And if we count that out on the wheel, we get to 25 degrees of Cancer. So there's a Cancerian hue to this trine energy. So again, this idea of birth and separation, but also this idea of separation in terms of things like racism is not such a great thing. This 25 degree point is conjunct more or less to the sun at 23 degrees. And so this idea of our life force, our vitality. So all of these themes are present and relevant in this chart. So I think it's an amazing chart. There's a zillion more things that could probably be said about it, and I'll probably stop this and be like, I wanted to talk about this too. But I think I've probably said enough and probably given you a good idea of some of the energies. But always remember that these are just the ways that I happen to see things and think about things. They're very much based on how, my life experience and my understanding of the energy, the different symbolic meanings of things and my particular spin on them. So, if this resonates with you and it helps, then that's wonderful. And if it doesn't, that's fine too. The most important thing is pay attention to your own experiences. And because that's what's true for you. It's not anything I or anybody else says. It's what you're actually experiencing and your relationship with that and how you navigate that. And Taurus, I just should end by saying Taurus also has to do with trust. So trust yourself, not me or anybody else, not what I happen to say or see or anything like that. Trust yourself. But again, if this is helpful, that's wonderful. But don't take it as gospel. Don't take it as this is what is. It's just what I'm seeing. And I'm very excited about these next couple of years. I'm very excited about the energies that I'm seeing here. Uranus at its core is about freedom. And, so the idea of will just be, I think information and just things are going to be happening that are just going to bring us to another level of freedom. But we have to show up for that, right? If things are coming to the surface, we have to show up for that. We have to do the work of whatever is asking to be processed and that sort of thing. So, okay, I think I have said enough. But again, thank you for listening. Trust you, not me. And if this is helpful, that's wonderful. And I will leave it there. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.